At the opera house, where chandeliers glitter and voices soar, a single shot silences the final note. In a balcony cloaked in velvet and privilege, a murder hides behind the mask of high society. Nero Wolfe is summoned to uncover the secrets that fell with the curtain. Where in the world are you listening tonight? Tell us in the comments. Now let's begin the mystery. The Met may have its chandeliers, La Scala its legends, but I'll tell you something. Nothing rattles Nero Wolfe more than a disturbance in the sanctity of his routines. So, when Fritz set out Wolfe's breakfast tray and discovered the Morning Times was missing, you'd think a revolution had broken out in Montenegro. I was there, of course, leaning on the jamb of the office doorway, watching Wolfe scowl at the empty space on the stand where the newspaper usually sat, precisely folded and ready for his inspection with orange juice and eggs. It was as if someone had stolen a tiara off a duchess's head while she was still wearing it. "Archie," Wolfe rumbled, eyes narrowing. "This is insupportable." I kept my hands in my pockets because a man has to hold on to something when Wolfe's blood pressure climbs. Paperboy probably got mugged by a crossword fiend. "Relax. I'll buy another down the block." "You will not," Wolfe snapped. "This is deliberate." "It is interference." He was glaring at me as though I had sold state secrets to the Swiss. I was about to suggest a sedative when the front bell chimed. The timing was too perfect, like cymbals crashing at the end of a bad overture. "Attend to it," Wolfe ordered, with the tone of a Roman emperor sending me to feed lions. I opened the door to find a woman dressed for mourning in everything but the veil. Tall, angular, in a black coat with pearl buttons, she carried the kind of perfume that could make a cabbie think twice about rolling his window down. Her eyes darted past me, as though she expected a rescue committee to appear. "I need to see Mr. Wolfe," she said, breathless. "At once." I gave her the patented Archie grin, the one that usually loosens people up. "Lady, you and about a half of Manhattan. Step inside." She followed me into the office, where Wolfe had arranged himself like a suspicious Buddha behind his desk, his lips pressed into a line that said he had better things to do, like cultivating orchids, alphabetizing his beer caps, or prosecuting me for larceny of his patients. "Your name, madam?" Wolfe asked. "Mrs. Rosalie Worthington." She paused, then added with a quiver, "My husband was murdered last night." In the opera balcony, that line was good enough to knock the morning paper out of Wolfe's mind, at least for 5 seconds. He shifted in his chair, which for Wolfe was the equivalent of an ordinary man jumping a fence. I coughed. "Murdered? At the Met? Did the soprano hit a high C sharp and split his skull?" Mrs. Worthington ignored me. Her gloved hand produced a crumpled program, smeared with something that looked unpleasantly like dried blood. This was in his pocket. "He died during the intermission. And the police think—" She stopped, biting down on the words. Wolfe eyed the program as though it might contaminate his mahogany desk. "The police think what?" "That he was poisoned. And that I am the obvious suspect." Well, that perked me up. You can't buy dialogue like that, not even in Times Square. I whistled softly. "So you came to us instead of legal aid." "Why?" She met my gaze, steel under the trembling. "Because your Mr. Wolfe has a reputation, he understands people, and because I can pay." She slid an envelope across the desk. Thick, green, and enticing. Now, Wolfe doesn't twitch at money the way some of us might, but he does notice envelopes heavy enough to tilt the balance of a desk. His fingers tapped once, twice, on the wood. "Your husband's name?" "Clinton Worthington. A patron of the opera. He had enemies, yes, but none who would dare such a theatrical gesture." Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes. I could tell he was running probabilities, shuffling motives, weighing the value of interruptions to his orchids. After a full 30 seconds of silence, I knew the case was about to tip. "Archie, he said at last, eyes still closed. "Make yourself useful. Telephone Inspector Kramer. Inform him that Mrs. Worthington is here, alleging suspicion in the matter of her husband's demise. Gauge his reaction." I frowned. "You're jumping in without seeing a single police report. This is a woman who has come uninvited into my house, intruding upon my morning routine and deposited—" His eyes flicked open to the bloody program. "A malodorous object upon my desk. That alone demands rebuttal." Mrs. Worthington's lips trembled. "Please, Mr. Wolfe." "I swear I had nothing to do with it. They'll hang me before the curtain call if you don't help." Wolfe exhaled like a tired bear. "Confound it. Very well. Archie, telephone." I reached for the receiver, but before I could dial, Fritz appeared in the doorway. His usually immaculate face was pale. "Excuse me, Mr. Wolfe. There is another visitor." We all turned. Behind Fritz, silhouetted in the hall's dim light, stood a uniformed policeman holding a folded Times under his arm. "Sorry to disturb you," the officer said, "but this paper was found dropped near the Opera House balcony. Looks like it belongs to the late Mr. Worthington. Thought you'd want to see it." Fritz hovered in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with the officer shadowing him. The man looked like the sort who could bluff his way into a speakeasy without showing ID. Lean, sharp-nosed, with a uniform cap pulled so low it nearly clipped his eyebrows. He kept the folded Times tucked under one arm as if he'd confiscated it from a bookie. "Detective Walsh," he said, flashing a badge just long enough for me to see the glint of brass. "Inspector Kramer sent me. I was told a Mrs. Rosalie Worthington was paying a visit." His eyes cut toward our guest, narrowing when they found her perched rigid on Wolfe's red leather chair. "And here she is." Mrs. Worthington drew herself up like she was about to sing an aria. "I came of my own free will. Mr. Wolfe is no enemy of the police." "Depends on the day," I muttered. But Wolfe silenced me with a glare that could have soured Fritz's cream. Walsh stepped into the room and, without asking permission, placed the newspaper on Wolfe's desk beside the bloody opera program. The contrast was obscene. Newsprint gray, program crimson. Wolfe grimaced as if the desk had just been converted into a butcher's block. "This was retrieved from the Met balcony floor," Walsh said. "Dropped near the seat. Mr. Worthington collapsed in. Inspector Kramer figures you'll want to see it before you start stirring mud." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "I have not yet agreed to stir mud, but I will look." He leaned forward, delicately unfolded the Times, and scanned the front page as though the crossword might confess. His lips pressed tight when his gaze snagged on something at the bottom corner. Without a word, he passed the paper to me. There, under the usual headlines, was a small rectangle of smudged pencil writing. Someone had scrawled words across the margin in a hand so jagged it looked like it had been written during an earthquake. I read it aloud. "Balcony. The curtain falls. Poison hides in plain sight." Mrs. Worthington gasped. Walsh stiffened. Wolfe closed his eyes as though a migraine had walked into the room and introduced itself. "Sounds like a riddle," I said, "or somebody's audition for Poe." "Or a warning," Mrs. Worthington whispered. Wolfe drummed his fingers. "Or an announcement. One must not assume the writer sought to prevent a death. They may well have intended to proclaim it." Walsh straightened, fixing Wolfe with a look. "Inspector Kramer isn't amused by riddles." "He'll be even less amused if you decide to obstruct," Wolfe muttered. "Inspector Kramer is rarely amused by anything." "Archie." "Yes, sir." "Accompany Detective Walsh to Inspector Kramer. Deliver him my compliments and this program." He tapped the blood-stained paper with one thick finger. "Tell him I may entertain the case, contingent upon further information." I didn't love the idea of playing errand boy with a uniform shadow, but Wolfe's tone made it an order, not a suggestion. I slipped the program into an envelope while Walsh watched me like I was lifting diamonds. Mrs. Worthington's face drained. "You're sending him away with evidence that might condemn me." Wolfe shifted his gaze to her, cool and heavy as a judge's gavel. "If you are innocent, Mrs. Worthington, truth will sustain you. If you are guilty, nothing will. I do not hoard evidence. I use it that shut her up, though her eyes blazed with desperate protest." I followed Walsh out, hat in hand, and we took a cab downtown. Walsh wasn't chatty, which suited me fine. I used the time to study him in the reflection of the cab window. Rigid shoulders, jaw set tight. This wasn't just duty. He carried a personal itch about the case. At homicide, Inspector Kramer looked like a man whose lunch had been poisoned. His cheeks burned under his bristly mustache, and his cigar smoldered at an angle that threatened to ignite the files on his desk. He grabbed the envelope from my hand and glared at the program. "Goodwin, if Wolfe thinks he can turn my office into a messenger service, he's got another thing coming." "Compliments, Inspector," I said smoothly. "And a little puzzle scribbled in the Times. You'll want to match handwriting. Maybe ask who had a pencil sharp enough to carve granite." Kramer scanned the paper, grunted, then jabbed a thumb toward the door. "Worthington died after swallowing a dose of cyanide disguised in his champagne. Everyone around him swears it was suicide. I don't buy it. Neither should Wolfe. Mrs. Worthington seems to think you're about to hang her without a trial." Kramer snorted smoke. "She's got motive, timing, and access. She inherits the fortune, doesn't she? Unless Wolfe can conjure an alternative, she'll be my prime suspect." I tipped my hat. "I'll let him know you're sharpening the noose." Back at the brownstone, Fritz let me in with the kind of expression reserved for funerals and tax audits. I found Wolfe exactly where I'd left him, in his chair, lips pressed together as Mrs. Worthington wrung her gloves into fabric spaghetti. "Well," Wolfe demanded. "Kramer's convinced it was cyanide in the bubbly," I reported. "Suicide, according to the witnesses, but he's not buying." "Mrs. Worthington is his favored candidate for the gallows." Her hands flew to her face. "It's a lie!" I never touched his glass. "Calm yourself," Wolfe said, though his tone contained as much comfort as a steel trap. "Archie, the handwriting?" Jagged, like a squirrel danced on the page. "We'll need Saul to run it against samples." Wolfe's lids drooped. "Perhaps." Just then, the phone rang, cutting through the tension like a trumpet blast in a requiem. I answered, and a crisp male voice crackled over the line. "This is Alan Phelps, attorney for the Worthington estate. I insist that Mrs. Worthington leave your premises at once. She is not to engage counsel outside my office." I raised an eyebrow at Wolfe, who gestured for silence. "Mr. Phelps," I said sweetly, "she's not exactly in chains here. But if you want to make it a tug of war, you're welcome to step by." The receiver clicked dead. I set it down slowly. "That sounded like a lawyer with a leash." Wolfe grunted. "Control breeds suspicion. Mrs. Worthington, did your husband trust this Phelps?" Her voice cracked. "Clinton trusted no one. But Phelps, he handled the finances, the donations, the investments." Wolfe opened his eyes, bright as coins under a lamp. "Investments?" "Yes. Archie, summon Saul Panzer. He will begin with Mr. Phelps." Mrs. Worthington sagged against the chair, looking as though the opera's final curtain had already dropped on her. The air in the office grew thick with the weight of secrets, and I couldn't shake the image of that scrawled warning in the Times, promising a death where poison hid in plain sight. And if Wolfe was right, we hadn't seen the last move in this grim performance. Mrs. Worthington lingered like a shadow that didn't know where to fall. Wolfe had closed his eyes, fingers pressed together as if he were composing an aria only he could hear. She sat across from him, her knuckles white, the gloves she had been wringing now shredded beyond redemption. I stood by the Globe bar, pretending I had something to do with the bottles, but really watching Wolfe's lips twitch. Always the surest sign his brain was scraping through layers of unpleasantness. When the doorbell rang again, Fritz's voice called in to announce Saul Panzer. Now, Saul is the kind of man you don't waste on small errands. If Wolfe was bringing him in this early, it meant the game had graduated from parlor amusement to professional stakes. Saul entered, nodding to Wolfe and giving me the barest flicker of a grin. He dropped into the chair I pointed to, his eyes taking in the room with the economy of a man who only bothers remembering what might later be important. Wolfe opened his eyes. Saul, there are 4 names I require preliminary attention on. Alan Phelps, attorney. Constance Greer, soprano. Martin Wexler, patron, and Emil Dvorak, conductor. All were present at last night's performance, and all had contact, however fleeting, with Clinton Worthington. Mrs. Worthington sat up. Constance. Emil. They were our friends. Clinton adored them. Wolfe gave her a stare so flat it might have been ironed. Adoration and malice are not mutually exclusive. Archie will supply Saul with details. That was my cue. I perched on the edge of the desk, pulling my notebook. Phelps we already know. The family lawyer who sounds like he'd love to see you gagged and bound in his office, Mrs. Worthington. Constance Greer sang last night's role. Mezzo with a reputation for high notes and low company. Martin Wexler, wealthy donor, rumored to bankroll more than just costumes. Emil Dvorak, the conductor, temper so sharp he once threw a baton at the stagehands. All of them crossed paths with your late husband in one way or another. Saul nodded, his pencil moving in quick strokes. He didn't need chatter, he just needed a map. You want them tailed or tapped? Both, judiciously, Wolfe said. Begin with Phelps. His urgency to retrieve Mrs. Worthington suggests fear of disclosure. Mrs. Worthington's voice quavered. Alan has handled Clinton's estate for years. He knows every account, every contribution. If something was hidden, he would... She stopped herself, as if the words had bitten her tongue. If something was hidden, Wolfe repeated softly. He would what? Her eyes filled with sudden panic. He would know. Saul pocketed his notes and rose. I'll start tonight. I'll let Archie know what sticks. When Saul left, the room sagged under the silence he always managed to leave behind. Wolfe shifted his bulk and opened his eyes fully. Archie. Present, I said. You will go to the Met. Speak with Constance Greer and Emil Dvorak. Do not trumpet your presence. Simply observe and inquire. Mrs. Worthington, you will remain here. Fritz will see to your needs. That last bit nearly made her protest, but Wolfe's tone flattened it. She subsided, clutching the tatters of her gloves like a relic. So off I went, my feet carrying me into the gaudy labyrinth of the opera house where velvet drapes could hide sins as easily as sopranos. Backstage smelled of dust, sweat, and expensive perfume, the kind that lingers after its owner has left. Constance Greer appeared in a swirl of silk dressing gown, cigarette dangling, voice husky from rehearsal. She saw me and arched a brow. You're not with the Times, are you? If you are, tell them I won't pose draped in mourning weeds for their ghastly feature. I'm not with the Times, I said, though I'll admit you'd make their circulation spike. I'm here about Clinton Worthington. Her laughter tinkled, brittle. Clinton? Dear man, always with the flowers and the fawning. Now he's gone and left poor Rosalie draped in suspicion. How operatic, wasn't it? I said. Did you see him during the intermission? She exhaled smoke that curled like a question mark. He came backstage, kissed my hand, congratulated me on an aria I hadn't yet sung. He was nervous, fidgeting, not like him at all. He left before the curtain rose again, and then, well, you know the rest. Any idea what made him nervous? She shrugged. Ask Martin Wexler. They had words earlier in the lobby. I thought Clinton was about to explode, but Martin just smiled that oily smile of his. That was a lead, but I played it casual. And Emil Dvorak. Her lips curved. Emil adored Clinton. He adored anyone who kept the checks coming. I thanked her and moved along the maze until I found Dvorak, storming at a violinist for missing a cue in rehearsal. His baton jabbed the air like a weapon, and when he finally noticed me, his scowl deepened. "What do you want?" he snapped. "Archie Goodwin," I said. "Private inquiry." Clinton Worthington. His shoulders stiffened, then sagged. Tragic. He was generous. Generous men should not die in balconies like paupers. "Did you see him last night?" Dvorak's eyes flicked away. "Only briefly. He congratulated me before the first act. He promised another donation to the orchestra fund. Then, nothing. I did not see him again. Did he seem nervous?" Dvorak's mouth tightened. He seemed troubled. But Clinton was always troubled. Money is a curse. He had too much of it. That was all he'd give me, and pressing him would have only earned me a baton in the ribs. I made my way out, my notebook heavier than my pockets, and headed back uptown. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk, eyes half closed, Mrs. Worthington still perched anxiously. I gave my report, laying out Constance's hint about Wexler and Dvorak's remark about money. Wolfe listened without moving, only the rise and fall of his chest betraying he hadn't turned to marble. When I finished, he opened his eyes. So, the widow's loyalty, the soprano's smoke, the conductor's evasion, and the lawyer's leash. "Archie, do you see the pattern?" "Sure," I said. Everyone wanted something from Clinton Worthington, and at least one of them didn't want to wait their turn. Wolfe grunted. Crude, but not inaccurate. We must identify which desire fermented into murder. Before I could answer, the phone rang again. I picked it up, expecting Saul, but a new voice hissed through the line. Low, urgent, hurried. "Tell Wolfe to stop digging." The balcony was only the beginning. Next time, the curtain falls on him. The line went dead. I turned slowly, the receiver heavy in my hand, and met Wolfe's gaze. His lips were pressed tight, his eyes glittering with something I didn't often see in them, real, cold anger. The line clicked dead, leaving the dial tone buzzing in my ear like a swarm of hornets. I replaced the receiver slowly, aware that Wolfe's eyes were boring into me from across the room. Mrs. Worthington had gone pale as the gloves she'd mangled. "Another admirer?" Wolfe asked dryly. "More like a critic," I said. "Somebody who doesn't want us sniffing around." "They promised the next curtain fall would be on you." Wolfe made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a snort. "Imbeciles. To threaten me directly is to announce impotence. Still," he opened his eyes fully now, his bulk shifting in the chair. "It means our adversary has both audacity and fear. Archie, we must identify which." Mrs. Worthington's voice cracked. "You see, they want to silence anyone who dares help me. You must believe me now." Wolfe looked at her as though she'd suggested he diet. "Madam, belief is not my profession. Proof is." "Sit," she sat, trembling. I perched on the arm of my chair, notebook ready. "So, what's the next move?" "First," Wolfe said, "telephone Saul. Ascertain if he has observed anything of Alan Phelps since leaving her." I dialed, got Saul on the line, and relayed Wolfe's question. Saul's voice was calm, even as always. "Phelps left his office around 6. Met with a man outside a club on 52nd. Looked tense. The man passed him a small parcel. Phelps tucked it under his arm like it was the crown jewels. I'll tail him home. I passed this along, and Wolfe closed his eyes again, digesting. "A parcel. Curious, could be anything," I said. "Cigars, sandwiches, cyanide samples." Wolfe ignored me. Next, we must gauge Martin Wexler. Constance Greer mentioned friction in the lobby. Archie, you will call upon him this evening. Take care to note his environment. The way a man displays his wealth often reveals the manner in which he acquired it. I nodded. And if he refuses to talk? Then provoke him, Wolfe said simply. I phoned ahead, arranged a visit under the pretense of press interest, and headed out. Wexler lived in one of those Upper East Side palaces where marble staircases compete with crystal chandeliers for the title of most likely to blind a visitor. A butler led me into a drawing room the size of a basketball court, where Wexler himself stood before a wall of oil portraits. He was round-faced, smooth-skinned, and smiled as though he'd invented charity. "Mr. Goodwin, I was told you wanted to ask about the opera tragedy," he said, gesturing me to a leather chair. So ghastly. Poor Clinton, such a supporter of the arts. Supporter or competitor? I asked lightly. The smile faltered. Competitor? Whatever do you mean? I hear you two had words in the lobby before the curtain rose. Wexler's cheeks colored faintly. Oh, that. A minor dispute about seating? He insisted a certain balcony box belonged to him by tradition. I reminded him the board had reassigned it. Hardly grounds for murder. Depends on how attached a man is to his balcony, I said, or how much he's invested in making sure his name stays on the donor plaque. He flinched just slightly. Mr. Goodwin, I'm loyal to this city's culture. My contributions are public record. If Clinton envied me, that is hardly my fault. I leaned forward. He envied you, or you envied him. For the first time, Wexler's voice hardened. Clinton had money to burn. He waved it about like confetti, buying influence where others earned it. Perhaps some resented him, but I assure you, I did not poison his glass. Funny, I said, standing. I didn't say anything about poison. That cracked the smooth surface. His eyes narrowed, the smile gone. Good night, Mr. Goodwin. I left before the butler could toss me, satisfied I'd struck a nerve. On the cab ride back, I replayed his reaction. Not guilt, exactly, but fear of exposure, which in this racket was practically a handshake. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe sat like a stone idol, Mrs. Worthington opposite him still as a statue. I delivered my report, adding every twitch and tremor I'd seen in Wexler's mansion. Envy, Wolfe murmured. Rivalry disguised as philanthropy. And yet, was it enough? Before I could answer, the phone rang again. This time it was Saul. Phelps went home, he said. Opened the parcel. Through the window I caught a glimpse. Looked like ledgers. Old, leather-bound. He's burning pages in his fireplace right now, I relayed this, and Wolfe's eyes snapped open. Archie, we must obtain one of those ledgers. Tonight I whistled. Breaking and entering isn't usually our style. Necessity dictates, Wolfe said flatly. If Phelps is destroying records, they contain the key. Go. Take Fred Durkin if needed. But bring me a page. So out I went again, dragging Fred along for muscle. We staked out Phelps' brownstone until his lights dimmed, then slipped in the back with a skill that would have made a burglar blush. Inside, the air reeked of burnt paper. Ash clung to the grate like snowflakes turned to soot. Fred muttered, "Guy's been busy." I sifted through the debris with gloved fingers until I found half a page not yet crumbled. Numbers, columns, names. Worthington's among them. And alongside it, an entry. Balcony fund. Transfer pending. I tucked it away and got out before the neighbors thought burglars had joined the opera. When we returned, Wolfe leaned forward eagerly, which in his case meant his chin descended an inch. I handed him the fragment. He studied it, lips tightening. Balcony fund, he said softly. So, the poison was not merely a murder, it was a message. Someone wished to tie Clinton Worthington's death to his finances. To a ledger entry he should not have made Mrs. Worthington grip the chair arms. "What does it mean?" Wolfe looked at her, his eyes glittering. "It means, madam, that your husband died not from jealousy or romance, but from money. Always money. The balcony was only the stage. The true drama lies in his accounts." The words hung heavy in the room. And in that moment, I realized we'd stumbled into a conspiracy deeper than applause and champagne flutes. Whoever had written that riddle in the newspaper hadn't just announced a death. They'd declared war on anyone who tried to read the ledgers, and now Wolfe had one fragment of proof and a target painted squarely on his chair. Wolfe studied the charred ledger fragment as if it were a rare orchid leaf, his eyes slitting narrower with each second. The room had gone silent except for the faint crackle of the fireplace. Mrs. Worthington's breathing was fast and shallow. Fritz hovered like an anxious nurse, his hands wringing the edge of his apron. "Balcony fund," Wolfe murmured again. "A curious designation. Archie, does it strike you as legitimate?" "It strikes me as something a crooked accountant would scribble down after 3 bourbons," I said. "But I'm no expert." "You want me to ask a friendly bookkeeper?" Wolfe's lips twitched in irritation. "No, I want facts. Find out if such a fund exists, publicly or privately, and who besides Clinton Worthington might have known of it." Mrs. Worthington clutched at the arms of her chair. "There were donations, yes. Clinton often used his wealth to secure boxes, sponsor productions, but this sounds like something hidden, something not in the open accounts indeed," Wolfe said, "which explains Mr. Phelps' eagerness to burn his ledgers." The phone rang, sharp as a pistol shot. I grabbed it before it startled Mrs. Worthington out of her skin. It was Saul. "I tailed Phelps again," he said. "He left his house after you. Went straight to the Greer woman's apartment. They argued for 20 minutes. He handed her another packet before storming out. She looked spooked. I relayed this, and Wolfe's brow furrowed. "So, our lawyer feeds the soprano." He sighed. "Archie, you will visit Miss Greer again. Take the packet if she will give it, or persuade her if she will not." I tipped my hat. "Charm or pressure?" "Both," Wolfe said. Constance Greer's apartment was a lush den of velvet, smoke, and the faint perfume of last night's admirers. She greeted me in a silk robe, eyes wide and guarded. "Back so soon, Mr. Goodwin. Don't tell me the opera has hired detectives as ushers." "Not quite," I said, stepping in. "But I hear you had a late delivery from Mr. Phelps." "Care to show me what's in the parcel before he decides to set it on fire, too?" Her laugh was brittle. "You think I let lawyers bring me gifts? This was nothing. Notes, old correspondence. He wanted me to keep them safe." "Safe from what?" "Or from whom?" I asked. "The police? Wolfe? The ghost of Clinton Worthington?" Her hand trembled as she lit another cigarette. "Clinton promised me." She stopped herself, then shook her head. "Never mind. Take it if you like." "I don't want it." She fetched the packet from a drawer and tossed it onto the coffee table. I scooped it up, slipped it under my arm. "Generous of you. Want to tell me what Clinton promised you before I guess?" Her eyes flashed with a mix of shame and anger. "A role. A guaranteed role in next season's productions. He said his money could move mountains, and now he's gone, and so is my promise." I gave her a steady look. "That's rough. But it doesn't explain why Phelps wants you babysitting his paperwork." Her lips tightened. "Ask him. Or better yet, ask Martin Wexler. They hated each other more than lovers hate betrayal." That was all she would give me, and I wasn't about to linger in case Phelps doubled back. I headed for the brownstone, parcel intact. Back in Wolfe's office, he took the packet with the disdain of a man accepting a soiled handkerchief. He opened it carefully, flipping through letters and documents. His expression didn't change, but the air around him grew taut. "Forged pledges," he said at last. "Letters promising funds that never existed. Clinton promised the opera money he did not have, or did not intend to give," and Phelps knew Mrs. Worthington gasped. "That's impossible." Clinton was wealthy, yes, but he would never forge promises. "Wouldn't he?" Wolfe said coldly. Perhaps he juggled appearances to maintain influence. Perhaps someone discovered the deceit. "That would be a motive both strong and dangerous," I whistled. So the man wasn't just a patron, he was a magician with fake rabbits. "And somebody decided to pull the trap door," Wolfe leaned back, steepling his fingers. "We must now consider who most profited from exposure." Phelps sought to conceal it. Constance Greer stood to lose her promised role. Martin Wexler, rival patron, could benefit by revealing Clinton's fraud. And Emil Dvorak, conductor, might have feared losing funding for his orchestra. As he spoke, the doorbell rang again. Fritz admitted Inspector Kramer, who barged in with cigar smoke already clinging to his coat. He glared at Wolfe as if he'd come to drag him down to headquarters personally. "Wolfe," he barked, "if you're meddling in this case, you'd better tread light. We've got testimony placing Rosalie Worthington at her husband's side before the intermission." She poured his champagne. Mrs. Worthington shot to her feet. "That's a lie. I never touched his glass." Kramer sneered. "A waiter says otherwise." "Care to explain?" She turned desperate eyes to Wolfe. He didn't move. "Inspector, you know my rule. I do not permit clients to be interrogated here. Then I'll take her downtown." "No," Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble. "You will not. She remains under my roof until I conclude my inquiry. Archie, show the inspector out." I braced myself for fireworks, but Kramer only grunted, muttered a curse, and stormed out. The silence afterward was heavy. Mrs. Worthington slumped back, tears threatening. "He'll destroy me." "You're the only one who can save me." Wolfe's gaze was merciless. "Then answer truthfully. Did you pour your husband's champagne?" She swallowed. "Yes, but only because he asked me to." He said his hands trembled. I had no idea what was in it. Her words hung there, quivering with the weight of guilt or honesty. It was impossible to tell. Wolfe didn't blink. "Archie, we have reached the point where concealment becomes perilous. Tomorrow you will bring all 4 suspects here, one by one if necessary. I intend to hear their accounts in this room." I raised a brow. "You want a parade or an ambush?" "A gathering," Wolfe said. "But first, Saul must learn whether Phelps destroyed all those ledgers, or only some. If others remain, they are the fulcrum of this affair." Mrs. Worthington clasped her hands. "And if he has destroyed them all?" Wolfe's voice was iron. "Then someone, somewhere, will still betray themselves." They always do. The tension in. The room was thick enough to spread on toast. I leaned against the desk, tapping my notebook. "Well, if someone's planning another curtain fall, we'd better brace for applause." Wolfe closed his eyes, sinking deeper into thought. But I knew what that glitter in them meant. Whoever had tried to scare him off had made a grave mistake. Nero Wolfe never backed down when the threat was personal, and the way things were building, the real performance was just about to begin. The atmosphere in Wolfe's office after Kramer's stormy departure was thick enough to slice. Mrs. Worthington sat hunched in the red leather chair, staring at the carpet like it might swallow her whole. Fritz, silent as a monk, removed the untouched tray of sandwiches. Wolfe sat back with his eyes closed, lips pressed in a line that meant his brain was parsing motives like a machine sorting coins. I leaned against the window, flipping my notebook shut. "Are we expecting the cavalry tomorrow?" I asked, "or just the whole opera company with trumpets?" Wolfe's eyes opened a fraction. "We are expecting the truth. Whether it arrives willingly or must be extracted, that is the variable." Mrs. Worthington looked up sharply. You'll make them come here. Emil, Constance, Wexler, all of them. Yes, Wolfe said without a flicker of hesitation. I will have each seated in this room where I can measure their words and silences. Only then will the structure reveal itself. She clasped her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened. And if one of them tries to harm you? You heard the caller. They threatened you directly. Wolfe grunted. An idle menace. If they meant to act, they would have done so already. Archie, call Saul, I dialed. Got Saul's unhurried tone on the line. He had more news. Phelps hadn't stopped at Constance Greer's. He'd later met with a banker in a private club. Saul hadn't gotten close enough to overhear, but he swore Phelps handed over another packet. And Goodwin, Saul added, the banker left looking like a man carrying dynamite in his pocket. Scared, but eager to hide it. When I repeated this, Wolfe let out a low, satisfied rumble. So, the contagion spreads. Clinton Worthington's fraud infected more than one ledger. This banker is now compromised. That makes 3 people holding secrets that could singe their eyebrows if they catch flame, I said. Phelps, Constance, and now a banker pal. You want me to knock on his vault and ask what's inside? No, Wolfe replied. Saul will continue. You, Archie, will press Constance Greer further. She yielded too easily earlier. Fear loosens lips, but it also breeds deception. She is concealing more than a broken promise of a role Mrs. Worthington stirred. She and Clinton were close. Too close. He gave her gifts. I found jewelry once said to be from a patron. He swore it was nothing. Wolfe's brow twitched. Useful, but we must confirm. So back out, I went, second trip to Constance in as many days. She answered this time in a satin dress and a glare sharp enough to shave ice. Mr. Goodwin, I thought I made myself clear. I've told you all I know, I smiled. You told me some. Not all. Why don't we fill in the gaps before Wolfe decides to invite you for a recital at his brownstone? His audience isn't forgiving. Her eyes flickered. You wouldn't dare. Lady, you don't know Wolfe. He'll dare while sitting down. Now tell me about the jewelry. The gifts, she froze. Cigarette half raised. Rosalie told you. She told Wolfe. I just collect the encore. Who gave you the necklace? Clinton or Martin Wexler? Her lip curled. Clinton. Always Clinton. He thought throwing pearls could buy loyalty. He promised me the role. Then he withdrew. Why? Her shoulders slumped. He said Phelps warned him. That if he didn't curb his gifts, if he didn't stop flaunting money he didn't have, the scandal would destroy him. He was terrified. That night he was sweating like a schoolboy. I thought he'd collapse even before he sipped the champagne. That was worth tucking in my pocket. I thanked her, left before she slammed the door in my face, and returned uptown. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened as I relayed every word. His eyes gleamed. So, Phelps restrained his client's indulgences, not from prudence, but from fear of exposure. The forged pledges were becoming untenable. Clinton's behavior risked discovery. And then, sudden death. Mrs. Worthington's voice shook. You mean Alan killed him? Wolfe shook his head. I mean only that he profited from silencing Clinton. Others profited as well. Martin Wexler ascends as leading patron. Constance loses her promised role but retains her reputation by silence. Emil Dvorak secures funding elsewhere. We must determine who feared discovery most, enough to poison a glass. The phone rang again. I answered, and this time it was Fred Durkin. He'd been watching Wexler. The guy met with Emil Dvorak tonight. They spoke heatedly in the street. Dvorak kept waving his arms, looked ready to crack his baton over Wexler's head. Then Wexler shoved an envelope into his coat pocket. They split, I told Wolfe, and his face tightened with interest. Excellent. The circle begins to close. Archie, tomorrow morning, you will fetch all 4 here. Use whatever pretext necessary. By evening, I want them in my office." Mrs. Worthington rose, her eyes wide with fear. "And me? What if the police come for me before then?" "They will not," Wolfe said flatly. "Kramer will wait. He cannot risk a public debacle if the truth lies elsewhere. You will remain here, under my protection." She sat down again, visibly trembling. Wolfe leaned back, folding his hands across his belly. "Archie, tomorrow we shall play host, and by the end of it, our poisoner will have revealed themselves." I nodded, though my gut told me tomorrow wouldn't just be tea and talk. Someone had already threatened Wolfe, and bringing the whole cast of suspects into his office was inviting a second act of fireworks. Still, I knew one thing. Wolfe thrived on pressure, and when the suspects assembled under his roof, the fat man in the chair would turn their motives into kindling. All I had to do was keep the house standing while he struck the match. The next morning, Wolfe's instructions had me running errands like a bellhop at a hotel with only one guest. My mission, round up the cast of characters and bring them to the brownstone for what promised to be Wolfe's private opera. Only instead of arias, there'd be accusations, and instead of curtain calls, maybe handcuffs. I started with Constance Greer, who answered her door wearing a fox fur coat that probably cost more than my yearly salary. She looked at me like I was the delivery boy with bad news. "Mr. Goodwin, again. You've been haunting me more than my critics, better me than the police," I said. "Wolfe wants you at his place this afternoon. He's giving you the chance to explain yourself in private before Inspector Kramer decides to make it public." She inhaled sharply, smoke curling from her cigarette holder. "I have rehearsals." "Cancel them," I said. "Think of it as a matinee. Wolfe's audience is small but influential." Her eyes narrowed, but she nodded, recognizing the steel under the suggestion. Next stop was Emil Dvorak, who was in the middle of berating a stagehand about tempos. I waited until the poor guy fled, then gave my pitch. "Wolfe wants to see you." Today, Dvorak glared. "I am rehearsing." "Yeah, well, unless you want to rehearse giving testimony in court, you'd better put Wolfe on your schedule. He has a way of conducting things too, and he doesn't wave a baton." His jaw clenched, but he agreed. Martin Wexler was trickier. His butler tried to block me, but I pushed past into the sun-drenched drawing room. Wexler was pacing like a man with ants in his shoes. "What is it now?" he snapped. "Wolfe," I said. "This afternoon. Don't be late." "I refuse." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Refuse, and the cops will be the ones knocking next. You had words with Clinton before he died. You had motive, and you had opportunity. Wolfe's the only man who can keep Kramer from pinning this on the wrong person, or on you. Be smart." His mouth worked, his face red as a sunset, but finally he spat. "Fine, I'll come." That left Phelps. I caught him leaving his office, his briefcase bulging like it had been force-fed. "Mr. Phelps," I said smoothly, "Wolfe requests your attendance today." He gave me a cold smile. "Wolfe requests? That sounds like an order. Tell him I represent Mrs. Worthington. My client is not obliged to submit to his whims." "Maybe not," I said, "but you are, unless you want the press sniffing around those ledgers you've been roasting. Wolfe knows. If you don't show, the cops will." The smile faltered. He tightened his grip on the briefcase. "Very well." This afternoon mission accomplished, I returned to the brownstone, where Wolfe sat like a mountain, immovable as ever. Mrs. Worthington perched nearby, her nerves wound tight. I reported success, and Wolfe nodded once as if I'd merely fetched the groceries. At 4:00, the parade began. Fritz opened the door first to Constance, who swept in with the hauteur of a queen visiting a rival court. Next came Emil, stiff as a soldier, his eyes darting. Wexler followed, his face pinched. Finally, Phelps arrived, briefcase in hand, his lips pressed tight as though he'd swallowed something sour. Wolfe let them settle in the office, each on a chair angled to face his desk. He didn't speak at first. He just let the silence do the work, the kind that crawls under your skin and makes your collar feel too tight. Finally, Wolfe opened his eyes. "You're here because you each had ties to Clinton Worthington. You're also here because one of you poisoned him." Gasps and protests erupted like a badly tuned orchestra. Constance insisted she'd never harm Clinton. Emil roared that he was an artist, not a killer. Wexler scoffed that the idea was absurd, and Phelps simply sneered. Wolfe raised a hand, and the noise cut like he'd pulled a plug. "Do not waste my time with denials. I am not the police. I do not need to prove guilt beyond doubt. I need only to know who." Phelps leaned forward, his voice sharp. "This is outrageous." "You have no authority." "No," Wolfe said calmly, "but I have clarity." "And you lack both. I stepped in with the props. Program, newspaper with the riddle, charred ledger fragment, and Phelps' packet of forged pledges. I laid them out like cards on a table." "These," Wolfe said, "are the keys." Clinton promised funds he did not possess. He deceived the opera, the board, his rivals. He intended to maintain his standing by fraud. Someone discovered this and feared either ruin or exposure. So they silenced him. Constance's hand trembled on her cigarette. He promised me." "Yes," Wolfe cut her off. "A role he could not secure without money. You were a victim, not a killer." Her relief was visible. "Emil Dvorak," Wolfe went on, "you feared losing funding. But you received envelopes, not ruin. You were bribed, not betrayed. You did not kill him." Emil's mouth opened, but no words came. Wolfe's gaze turned to Wexler. "You envied his influence. You quarreled with him, but envy alone does not yield poison. You are too cautious to risk scandal." Wexler bristled, but stayed silent. Finally, Wolfe's eyes settled on Phelps. "But you who burned ledgers, concealed pledges, tried to silence Rosalie by forbidding her counsel. You alone stood to lose everything if Clinton's fraud was revealed. Your career, your livelihood, your reputation. You did not act from passion, but from calculation. You poisoned him, Mr. Phelps." The room froze. Constance gasped. Emil swore. Wexler leaned forward. Mrs. Worthington covered her mouth. Phelps laughed, short and sharp. "Ridiculous." Wolfe didn't flinch. "Archie." "The fragment. Please," I handed it over. Wolfe held it up. "This entry, balcony fund, transfer pending. Who but you would write such a thing? Who but you would use the balcony as both ledger and stage?" Phelps' face went pale. His hand tightened on the briefcase. For a moment, I thought he'd bolt. I shifted closer, ready. Then he hissed, "You can't prove—" "Kramer will," Wolfe said calmly. "Archie, call him." Phelps sagged, the fight draining. Constance turned away in disgust. Emil muttered something in Czech. Wexler exhaled as though relieved it wasn't him. Mrs. Worthington's eyes brimmed with tears, fixed on Wolfe like he was salvation. I went for the phone, dialing homicide. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes again, already retreating into the fortress of his mind. The performance was nearly over, and as I watched the suspects squirm in silence, I realized Wolfe had staged the most effective opera of all, one with no orchestra, no costumes, just words sharp enough to slice a murderer down to size. Kramer arrived in less time than it takes Fritz to whip egg whites stiff, which told me he'd either been lurking nearby or had already been sniffing around the edges of the case. He barged into the office with his cigar chewing up more oxygen than his lungs did, and the look on his face said he expected Wolfe to hand him a murderer with a bow on top. "What is this I hear?" he barked. "About you summoning my suspects and putting on one of your drawing-room dramas." Wolfe didn't open his eyes. "You hear correctly, Inspector. They are here, and one of them is your man." Kramer grunted, glanced at the assembled faces. Constance Greer had retreated into her fox fur like a nervous cat. Emil Dvorak sat stiffly, hands clenched on his knees. Martin Wexler stared at the carpet as though it might explain things better than Wolfe. And Phelps had gone grey, his briefcase gripped like it contained the last of his oxygen. "All right, Wolfe," Kramer said. "Spill it." "Which one?" "Mr. Phelps," Wolfe replied evenly. That set off the chorus again. Gasps, protests, a sputter from Phelps himself. He stood, briefcase half-raised, pointing at Wolfe with a trembling hand. "You can't. This is slander. You have no proof." Wolfe opened his eyes at last, heavy-lidded but glinting. "You wrote the ledger entries. You burned the records. You attempted to conceal forged pledges and then spread the fragments among those who might be compromised, hoping to dilute suspicion. You feared that Clinton Worthington, by his reckless behavior, would reveal the fraud you had orchestrated in his name. So you silenced him." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "That true?" Phelps's lips moved, but the words came out jagged. "It was Clinton. He told me. He made me." Wolfe muttered. "Clinton was vain and foolish, but not so skilled. You constructed the machinery. You controlled the accounts. He provided the name and the wealth. You provided the deception. And when he panicked, you chose poison." Kramer stepped forward. "That briefcase. Hand it over." For a moment I thought Phelps would bolt, but two uniformed cops shadowing Kramer filled the doorway. Phelps sagged, handed it over. Kramer dropped it on Wolfe's desk, opened it. Inside were more charred fragments, ledgers, correspondence, enough to choke an auditor. "That's it," Kramer said, snapping his cigar. "That's all I need." "Phelps, you're coming downtown." The lawyer tried one last gasp. "This is a circus. He can't." Kramer cut him off. "Save it for your lawyer. And I don't mean you," he signaled the uniforms, who took Phelps by the arms and marched him out. The office went still. Constance dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Emil muttered something under his breath, part relief, part prayer. Wexler exhaled like a man whose lungs had just been returned. Mrs. Worthington sat frozen, her face pale but her eyes burning with tears of release. "So it's true. Alan, all this time, he managed everything for Clinton. I never suspected." Wolfe closed his eyes again, leaning back. "Your ignorance is plausible, madam. Whether the law will deem it excusable is another matter." She flinched, but Wolfe didn't soften. He never did. Kramer lingered, glaring at Wolfe. "One of these days, Wolfe, I'll get tired of you poaching my cases." "You are already tired of it," Wolfe replied calmly. "But you benefit too often to stop me." Kramer growled, jammed the cigar back between his teeth and stomped out with his men. The sound of the door slamming carried down the hall like the final drum beat of a march. The room settled into uneasy silence. Constance was the first to break it. "I suppose I should thank you, Mr. Wolfe." "At least now the whispers will stop." Wolfe opened one eye. "Do not thank me. Your ambitions remain petty, but not criminal. Do not mistake the two." She flushed, gathered her things, and left in a swirl of perfume. Emil rose stiffly, bowed curtly, and followed. Wexler lingered a moment longer, eyes dark. "You may have cleared me today, Wolfe, but don't think I'll forget the insinuations." "I never think of you at all," Wolfe said. That stung enough to send Wexler stalking out, his pride limping behind him. At last, only Mrs. Worthington remained. She rose slowly, her voice trembling. "Mr. Wolfe, how can I ever repay you?" Wolfe waved a hand as if brushing away dust. Your presence here has disrupted my household, cost me time and endangered my tranquility. You have already repaid me. Adequately. She looked at him, startled, then glanced at me. I gave her a reassuring smile. Don't worry, Mrs. Worthington. In Wolfe's language, that's practically a valentine. She gave a shaky laugh, thanked us again, and left. When the door finally closed behind her, the brownstone sank back into its familiar rhythm. Fritz's footsteps padded away toward the kitchen. Outside, traffic hummed like distant machinery. Inside, Wolfe leaned back, eyes shut, already withdrawing into his cocoon of orchids and beer. I crossed to the desk, resting a hand on the pile of evidence Kramer had left behind. You know, I've got to hand it to you. You staged the whole thing like an opera. Balcony, poison, the lot. You even gave Kramer his curtain call. Wolfe grunted, uninterested in praise. It was inevitable. Phelps erred by threatening me. He revealed desperation. That is always the undoing of men like him. I sank into my chair, stretching my legs. Still, you've got to admit, it played out like a drama. Worthington, the patron saint of fraud. Phelps, the lawyer who thought he was smarter than poison. Constance, the diva. Emile, the conductor with a short fuse. Wexler, the jealous rival. All that was missing was a chorus line. Wolfe opened his eyes just long enough to glare at me. Archie. Enough. Sure, I said lightly. But don't blame me if someday the Met decides to stage the case of the opera balcony. His eyes closed again, the faintest of sighs escaping him. I knew the case was over. For Wolfe, the curtain had dropped. For me, it was just another night in the brownstone, filing notes, keeping watch, waiting for the next knock on the door that would shatter the routine all over again. When the last echo of Mrs. Worthington's heels faded down the steps, the brownstone sighed into stillness. Fritz drifted back in with the calm precision of a man who considered silence part of the household furniture. He placed a tray with cold beer and glasses on the side table and vanished. Wolfe, true to form, reached without opening his eyes, poured and sipped as if the entire day had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. I, on the other hand, was not so quick to dismiss it. I leaned against the edge of his desk, flipping through my notebook, the ink still fresh from the afternoon's fireworks. So that's it, huh? Phelps in bracelets, Worthington's widow cleared, and Kramer getting to puff himself up on a case he barely lifted a finger for. A neat bow. Archie, Wolfe rumbled, do not cheapen resolution with frivolity. It is neither a bow nor neat. It is a sordid tale of deceit, exposure, and human frailty. Neatness belongs in Fritz's kitchen, not in human affairs. Fine, I said, settling into my chair. Then explain to me why I'm still chewing it over. Because something about today felt too easy. Phelps was slick, but he cracked fast. Almost like he'd been expecting the curtain to drop, Wolfe's lids lifted a fraction. You suspect orchestration. I suspect performance. Maybe he was the guilty man. He had motive, he had means, and he sure had the habit of torching paper like it was firewood. But his breakdown in front of Kramer felt rehearsed, almost convenient. Wolfe steepled his fingers, his bulk sinking deeper into the chair. Convenient for whom? That was the rub. I didn't answer right away because my gut wasn't offering a name. Instead, I replayed the scene in Wolfe's office. Constance trembling but relieved, Emile stiff as a board, Wexler bristling at insult, and Phelps collapsing like a house of cards. Too fast, too final. I don't know yet, I admitted. But if someone wanted Phelps to take the fall, they staged it well. Perhaps, Wolfe allowed. But remember, false neatness is as dangerous as false disorder. We must be certain. The phone rang again, shrill against the calm. I answered, half expecting Saul. Instead, it was Fred Durkin. Goodwin, you'll want this. After Phelps was hauled out, I kept tailing. They took him to the precinct, but on the way, he muttered something to the uniforms. Said, "Tell them to check the second ledger." The real one. Balcony wasn't mine. Then he shut up. I froze. The second ledger. You sure? Clear as day, Fred said. Thought you'd want to know. I hung up, relayed it. Wolfe's eyes snapped open fully now, glittering. So, the man protests after all, not denial of guilt, but redirection. A second ledger. And we never saw it, I said slowly. If it exists, then Phelps may be guilty of fraud, but not necessarily of murder. Somebody else could have spiked the champagne and let him burn for it. Wolfe inhaled deeply, the way he does when the orchids upstairs are in full bloom and he's catching their scent. Archie. The performance is not yet finished, I groaned. So much for the neat bow. He ignored me, reaching for another bottle of beer. Tomorrow we resume. Saul must locate this second ledger. Fred and Ori will resume tales. You will press our remaining suspects once more. Do not mention the ledger. Observe who betrays knowledge of it. Lovely, I said. So I get to go back to the opera crowd and see who's humming off key. That is your métier, Wolfe said simply. The following morning, I set out with fresh orders. Constance first. She received me with a sharp smile, like she'd been expecting applause. So, it was Phelps after all. I knew it. Did you? I asked casually. Funny, because he claims there's another ledger. A real one. Her smile faltered, just for a second. She covered it by lighting a cigarette. Lawyers always keep more than one set of books. It's their profession. Interesting you'd know that, I said. She waved it off, but her hands shook as she exhaled. I left her stewing in her smoke. Next stop, Emil Dvorak. He was rehearsing again, barking at the orchestra. When I cornered him, he spat, "Why do you people not leave me alone?" Phelps is guilty. It is over. Sure, I said, unless there's another ledger floating around. A second set of books that proves otherwise. The color drained from his face. Ledger? What ledger? You tell me, I said, watching his eyes flicker. He sputtered denials, but the sweat on his forehead told me he knew more than he should. Finally, Wexler. He tried to play it cool in his marble mausoleum, sipping brandy at noon. I trust Wolfe has resolved things. Resolved? I asked. Not exactly. Phelps says there's another ledger. The glass slipped in his hand, brandy spilling onto the carpet. He cursed, dabbed it with a napkin. The man is a liar. Desperate. You can't believe him. Maybe not, I said, but you sure reacted like you've seen it. He glared, jaw tight. Leave my house. I did, with a smile, because his slip had been worth more than brandy stains. Back at the brownstone, I reported everything. Wolfe listened, eyes closed, fingers tapping once against his belly. When I finished, he opened them, sharp as knives. So, each betrays knowledge of a ledger none of them should know exists. Phelps is guilty of fraud, but the hand that tipped poison into Clinton Worthington's glass may not be his. The balance shifts. Great, I said. So we're back to square one, except now the board is messier. Not messier, Wolfe corrected. More precise. The second ledger is the fulcrum. Find it, and we find the murderer. I sat back, running a hand through my hair. And how do we do that? His eyes glimmered. By letting them bring it to us. The plan was forming already in his head, I could see it, and if I knew Wolfe, he'd sit right there in his chair until the ledger, the truth, and the guilty hand came to him like moths to his orchids. And me? I'd be the one fetching, running, and dodging bullets until it did. Wolfe didn't waste words once my report was finished. He leaned back in the chair, fingers steepled, eyes half closed, looking like a man about to doze through a sermon. But I'd seen that look before. It meant the fat man was listening to every echo, fitting every tremor into the structure inside his head. "Archie," he said finally, "the second ledger must surface. None of them will sleep while it remains hidden, for it damns them all in different measures. Our task is simple. We provide an opening, and one of them will betray themselves by reaching for it." I groaned. Simple, like juggling flaming knives while blindfolded. He ignored me. "You will draft notes. To each, Constance Greer, Emil Dvorak, Martin Wexler. Write that the second ledger has been found, and that Inspector Kramer will have it tomorrow morning. Then observe. Asked, "You expect me to just sit around with binoculars waiting to see who panics first?" "Precisely," Wolfe said, "but more efficiently. Saul, Fred, and Ori will each tail one. You will coordinate." Tonight I sighed, because when Wolfe used words like efficiently, it always meant I'd be doing the legwork while he stayed parked in his chair with beer and orchids. Still, the plan had teeth. I spent the afternoon drafting the bait, each note short and sharp. Ledger recovered. Police notified. Meeting at precinct tomorrow. NWA courier delivered them within the hour. By evening, the city was buzzing like a hive I'd just poked with a stick. Saul called first, calm as ever. Greer read it, turned pale, cancelled her rehearsal. She made 2 phone calls, one to a banker, one I couldn't trace. Packed a small bag. Looks ready to run. Fred reported next. Dvorak got the note during practice. He threw his baton across the pit, stormed out, stopped at a payphone, called somebody, kept shouting, "Destroy it." Then went home and started drinking. Finally, Ori checked in. Wexler's butler opened the door. Wexler read the note, laughed like a man who just got away with murder, then ordered his car. Drove straight to Phelps' office, but the place was locked tight. He circled twice, then went back uptown. I relayed it all, and Wolfe's lips pursed into what might have been approval. "So, each reacts in accordance with guilt, but only one will attempt retrieval. Tomorrow, Archie, you will arrange matters here. We shall host another gathering, and we shall see who tries to seize what does not exist." "Another parade?" I asked. "You sure you don't want to sell tickets?" He gave me the glare, the one that could flatten wallpaper. I shut up. That night I barely slept because tailing suspects and dangling bait does wonders for the nerves. By morning, Fritz was clattering breakfast like he was rehearsing for Wagner. Wolfe ate slowly, methodically, as though poisonings and false ledgers were merely seasoning. By afternoon, the suspects arrived one by one, each walking into the office like it was a trap, because it was. Constance came first, looking brittle and glamorous, her suitcase left with Fritz. Emil followed, red-eyed from drink, smelling of cologne thick enough to choke a goat. Wexler strode in last, smug and irritable, his eyes flicking around the room as though searching for the incriminating book. Wolfe opened his eyes, surveying them. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. You have been summoned because the missing ledger has been located. It is secure." The words hung heavy. Constance gasped, Emil cursed under his breath, and Wexler's jaw clenched. "Tomorrow," Wolfe continued, "Inspector Kramer will receive it. Unless," he paused, his eyes glinting, "the guilty party wishes to reveal themselves now." The silence cracked like glass under weight. Constance shifted, her hands trembling. Emil glared, but his eyes darted toward the desk drawer. Wexler sat back, arms crossed, but sweat beaded on his forehead. I played my part, moving around the room, leaning casually on the desk where Wolfe had planted a thick folder, empty, but no one knew that. My eyes swept them all, waiting for the twitch. It came from Emil. He rose suddenly, face twisted. "You cannot. You don't understand. That ledger," Wolfe's voice sliced through. "Sit down, Mr. Dvorak. But Emile lunged, reaching for the folder. I stepped in, caught his wrist, twisted, and shoved him back into the chair before he could tear the thing open. His face went gray, his body sagging as the fight drained. "There," Wolfe said, his tone almost weary. "The impulse reveals the truth. Not Phelps alone. He forged, yes, but Dvorak poisoned. Clinton's death ensured silence before the fraud collapsed." The conductor silenced the patron. Constance gasped. Wexler muttered a curse, and Emile covered his face with his hands. "He was ruining everything," he choked. "Without funding, without pledges, the orchestra dies. I only meant—" "You meant," Wolfe interrupted, "to preserve your music, but you chose murder. That is not preservation. That is destruction. I didn't wait for more." I called Kramer. By the time he arrived with his men, Emile was slumped and broken, the opera no longer in his voice. Kramer looked from Wolfe to me, suspicion in his eyes. "You're telling me this one did it?" "Not Phelps. Both are guilty," Wolfe said flatly. "Phelps of fraud. Dvorak of murder. Clinton Worthington was a fool. He surrounded himself with parasites. One bled him of reputation, the other of life." Kramer grunted. "Fine. We'll sort it downtown. But Wolfe, one of these days—" "Yes, Inspector," Wolfe murmured, already closing his eyes. Kramer left with Emile in cuffs, Constance trailing in tears, Wexler muttering under his breath. The brownstone breathed again, the storm passing. I leaned on the desk, exhaling. Well, that was one for the books. Balcony, poison, ledgers, fraud, music, and murder. Remind me to stick to ball game. Wolfe sighed, reached for his burr. "Remind me, Archie, never to attend the opera again." Fritz had just set dinner on the table when the house finally felt like itself again. The tension that had clung to the wall since Mrs. Worthington's first desperate knock seemed to dissolve with the smell of Fritz's roast duck. The orchids upstairs were safe. The office desk was clear of blood-stained programs and charred paper, and Wolfe was back where he belonged. Enthroned in his chair, beer within reach, eyes half-lidded but sharp as ever. I dropped into my own seat, loosening my tie. "So, that's the encore, huh?" Kramer left with both his hands full. "Phelps for fraud, Dvorak for murder. He'll be smoking 2 cigars at once tonight." Wolfe grunted, which meant agreement without enthusiasm. Kramer will crow, yes, but his satisfaction is secondary. "Secondary?" I asked, reaching for a slice of duck. "Come on, Wolfe. You exposed a fraud, pinned a poisoning, and managed to do it all without leaving your chair. That's a full night's work, even for you." He shifted slightly, as though the weight of the world and the meal balanced on his chest. The matter was ugly. Clinton Worthington was vain, reckless, and dishonest. Yet he did not deserve to die in a theater, reduced to spectacle. Murder is never merely pragmatic. It is the foulest expression of human will. I chewed in silence, watching him. He didn't make speeches often, not like that. When he did, it meant the case had gotten under his skin. Dvorak, Wolfe continued, believed art justified his crime. That preserving his orchestra excused destroying a man. Phelps believed expedience excused deceit. Both believed the ends forgave the means. They were wrong. I wiped my mouth, leaned back. "So what do you call it then?" "Justice?" He closed his eyes, lifting his glass. "Justice is a word for courts. What we provided was clarity, a line drawn where confusion reigned." "That is all clarity," I repeated. "Well, clarity kept Rosalie Worthington out of a cell. She might not thank you with roses, but I'll bet she thinks of you every time she hears an aria." His lips twitched, almost a smile. "That is her concern, not mine." We let the silence hang for a while, filled only by the sound of Fritz moving in the kitchen. The brownstone had returned to its rhythm. The storm passed, the curtain dropped. I raised my glass, grinning. Here's to the balcony, Wolfe. May the only thing that ever falls from one again be applause. Wolfe opened his eyes long enough to meet mine, then shut them with a sigh. Archie, your levity is intolerable. Drink and be silent, I did as ordered, smiling to myself. Because for all his grumbling, I knew the truth. Wolfe had won again. Without leaving the brownstone, without lifting more than a finger, he'd orchestrated a crime's final act like the conductor Dvorak had pretended to be. And for me, it was just another night of ink in the notebook, beer on the desk, and the fat man's voice drawing lines through lies until only the truth remained. The case of the opera balcony was finished, but the music of Wolfe's mind played on,